The Everyday Life of Abraham Lincoln by Francis Fisher Browne. Chapter 11c. Some sharp rejoinders, words of soberness, close of the conflict. In the party that attended Lincoln in the senatorial campaign was the Hon. Andrew Shuman, afterwards Lieutenant Governor of Illinois and one of the veteran journalists of Chicago. Mr. Shuman was detailed to report the joint debates for his paper, and he accompanied Lincoln through nearly all of the campaign, traveling with him by night, sometimes occupying the same room, and when in crowded quarters the same bed. He thus saw much of Lincoln, and had the best of opportunities for studying his character, not only hearing all his public speeches, but having long conversations with him in private, and listening to the stories, anecdotes, and gay or grave discourse by which the journeys and the frequent waits were enlivened. The group consisted of several gentlemen, including Norman B. Judd of Chicago, afterwards a member of Congress; Robert R. Hitt, who was Lincoln's shorthand reporter, afterwards member of Congress from Illinois; Mr. Villard, later the president of the Northern Pacific Railroad, then a newspaper correspondent; Mr. Shuman, and at various times other politicians and journalists. Of this party Lincoln was always the leading spirit in conversation. He would tell stories himself, and draw out stories from others, and his laugh, though not the loudest, was always the heartiest. Then he would pass to soberer themes, and discuss them with a tinge of that melancholy which, however he might be surrounded, never seemed far distant from him. At night, stopping at the country tavern, or at some friend's house, the evenings would be spent in discussion and story-telling, or perhaps in a humorous review of the events of the day; and after retiring Lincoln would entertain his companion, often far into the night, discoursing on many varied subjects, politics, literature, views of human life and character, or the prominent men and measures then before the country. One day, according to Governor Shuman, Lincoln had been announced to speak in a town in the extreme southern part of Illinois, in the very heart of Egypt, where there was a strong pro-slavery sentiment, and it was feared there might be trouble, as Lincoln's anti-slavery tendencies were well known. To make matters worse, a party of Kentuckians and Missourians had come over to attend the meeting, and it was noised about that they would not allow Lincoln to speak. He heard of it, and both he and his friends were somewhat apprehensive of trouble. The place of the meeting was a grove in the edge of town, the speakers occupying an improvised stand. The gathering was a large one, and it had every appearance of a Southern crowd. It was customary in those times for the men in that section of the country to carry pistols and ugly-looking knives strapped to their persons on public occasions. It was a semi-barbarous community, and their hatred of the abolitionists, as they called all anti-slavery men, was as intense as was their love of bad whiskey. Lincoln privately told his friends, who in that locality were very few in number, that if only they will give me a fair chance to say a few opening words, I'll fix them all right. Before mounting the speaker's stand he was introduced to many of the crowd, and shook their hands in the usual Western way. Getting a small company of the rough-looking fellows around him, he opened on them. "Fellow citizens of Southern Illinois, fellow citizens of the State of Kentucky, fellow citizens of Missouri," he said, in a tone more of conversation than of oratory, looking them straight in the eye, "I am told that there are some of you here present who would like to make trouble for me. I don't understand why they should. I am a plain common man like the rest of you, and why should not I have as good a right to speak my sentiments as the rest of you? Why, good friends, I am one of you. I am not an interloper here. I was born in Kentucky, raised in Illinois, just like most of you, and worked my way right along by hard scratching. I know the people of Kentucky, and I know the people of Southern Illinois, and I think I know the Missourians. I am one of them, and therefore ought to know them, and they ought to know me better. And if they did know me better, they would know that I am not disposed to make them trouble. Then why should they, or any one of them, want to make trouble for me? Don't do any such foolish thing, fellow citizens. Let us be friends, and treat each other like friends. I am one of the humblest and most peaceable men in the world, would wrong no man, would interfere with no man's rights, and all I ask is that, having something to say, you will give me a decent hearing. and being Illinoisians, Kentuckians, and Missourians, brave and gallant people, I feel sure that you will do that. And now let us reason together, like the honest fellows we are." Having uttered these words, his face the very picture of good nature and his voice full of sympathetic earnestness, he mounted the speaker's stand and proceeded to make one of the most impressive speeches against the further extension of slavery that he ever made in his life. He was listened to attentively, was applauded when he indulged in flashes of humor, and once or twice his eloquent passages were lustily cheered. His little opening remarks had calmed the threatening storm, had conquered his enemies, and he had smooth sailing. From that day to the time of his death Abraham Lincoln held a warm place in the respect of very many of those rough and rude Egyptians, and he had no warmer supporters for the Presidency, or while he was President, than they were. Mr. Leonard Volk, the sculptor who afterwards made an excellent bust of Lincoln, says, "My first meeting with Abraham Lincoln was in 1858, when the celebrated senatorial contest opened between him and Stephen A. Douglas. I was invited by the latter to accompany him and his party by a special train to Springfield, to which train was attached a platform car, having on board a cannon, which made considerable noise on the journey. At Bloomington we all stopped overnight, as Douglas had a speech to make there in the evening. The party went to the Landon House, the only hotel, I believe, in the place at that time. While we were sitting in the hotel office after supper, Mr. Lincoln entered, carrying an old carpet-bag in his hand, and wearing a weather-beaten silk hat, too large, apparently, for his head, a long, loose-fitting frock-coat of black alpaca, and vest and trousers of the same material. He walked up to the counter, and, saluting the clerk pleasantly, passed the bag over to him, and inquired if he was too late for supper. The clerk replied that supper was over, but perhaps enough could be scraped up for him. "All right," said Mr. Lincoln, "I don't want much." Meanwhile, he said, he would wash the dust off. He was certainly very dusty. It was the month of June, and quite warm. While he was so engaged, several old friends, who had learned of his arrival, rushed in to see him, some of them shouting, "How are you, old Abe?" Mr. Lincoln grasped them by the hand in his cordial manner, with the broadest and pleasantest smile on his rugged face. This was the first good view I had of the coming man. The next day we all stopped at the town of Lincoln, where short speeches were made by the contestants, and dinner was served at the hotel. After which, as Mr. Lincoln came out on the plank walk in front, I was formally presented to him. He saluted me with his natural cordiality, grasping my hand in both his large hands with a vice-like grip, and looking down into my face with his beaming, dark, full eyes, said, "How do you do? I am glad to meet you. I have read of you in the papers. You are making a statue of Judge Douglas for Governor Matteson's new house." "Yes, sir," I answered, "and sometime when you are in Chicago and can spare the time, I would like to have you sit to me for a bust." "Yes, I will, Mr. Volk. I shall be glad to, the first opportunity I have." All were soon on board the long train, crowded with people, going to hear the speeches at Springfield. The train stopped on the track near Edwards Grove, in the northern outskirts of the town, where staging was erected and a vast crowd waited under the shade of the trees. On leaving the train, most of the passengers climbed over the fences and crossed the stubble field, taking a short cut to the grove. Among them Mr. Lincoln, who stalked forward alone, taking immense strides, the before-mentioned carpet-bag and an umbrella in his hands, and his coat skirts flying in the breeze. I managed to keep pretty close in the rear of the tall, gaunt figure, with the head craned forward, apparently much over the balance, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, that was moving something like a hurricane across that rough stubble-field. The contest between Lincoln and Douglas seemed to be, as expressed by Dr. Newton Bateman, one between sharpness and greatness. Lincoln seemed to Dr. Bateman a man strongly possessed by a belief to which he was earnestly striving to win the people over, while the aim of Mr. Douglas seemed rather to be simply to defeat Mr. Lincoln. Yet, although Lincoln was usually earnest and considerate of his opponent, he could, when occasion required, bring his powers of humor and sarcasm into play in a very effective manner. A few pointed illustrations may be given. In his speech at Galesburg, Douglas sneeringly informed the citizens that Honest Abe had been a liquor seller. Lincoln met this with the candid admission that once in early life he had, under the pressure of poverty, accepted and for a few months held a position in a store where it was necessary for him to retail liquor. "But the difference between Judge Douglas and myself is just this," he added, "that while I was behind the bar, he was in front of it." At the close of the joint discussion at Alton, Douglas led off with a speech an hour long, in which he showed no little irritability. The campaign was evidently wearing on him. Lincoln, on the contrary, was in capital spirits. "He sat taking in the speech of Douglas with seeming immobility," says Mr. Jeriah Bonham, who was present, "and when it was ended he rose to reply. As in the opening of all his speeches, he spoke slowly, did not rise to his full height, leaning forward in a stooping posture at first, his person showing all the angularities of limb and face. For the first 5 or 10 minutes he was both awkward and diffident, as in almost monotonous tones he began to untangle the meshes of Douglas's sophistry. Proceeding, he gained confidence gradually. His voice rang out strong and clear. His tall form towered to its full height. His face grew radiant with impassioned feeling as he poured forth an outburst of crushing argument and inspiring eloquence. The people became wild with enthusiasm, but his voice rang loud above their cheers. Frequently in his speech he would turn toward Douglas and say with emphasis, "You know these things are so, Mr. Douglas," or "You know these things are not so, Mr. Douglas." At one time he bent his long body over his adversary, pouring in his arguments so sharply that Douglas, chafing under the attack, rose to explain. But Lincoln would not allow it. "Sit down, Mr. Douglas," said he peremptorily. "I did not interrupt you, and you shall not interrupt me. You will have opportunity to reply to me, if you can, in your closing speech." A good story is told of the occasion on which Lincoln and Douglas spoke in Chicago. A well-known citizen, who on account of his age was known familiarly as Father Brewster, a man of standing and a member of the Board of Education, was one of the listeners on the platform. Lincoln admired the old gentleman very much, and the admiration was mutual. They sat together while Douglas made the opening speech. He spoke for more than an hour, and never more brilliantly. When Lincoln's turn came, he could see that Father Brewster was exceedingly anxious as to the outcome. Lincoln arose, let out all the joints in his long body, slowly removed his overcoat and laid it across Mr. Brewster's knees. "Father Brewster," he said, "will you hold my overcoat while I stone Stephen?" Everybody shouted and cheered, and even Douglas joined in the laugh at his own expense. Beneath the humors and excitements of the campaign, the prevailing tone of Lincoln's thought was deeply serious and reflective. Toward the close, when indications pointed to his defeat for the Senate, he seemed somewhat depressed, and occasionally his old habitual melancholy would steal over him and impart to his words a touching pathos. On such an occasion, in one of the smaller cities of Illinois, Douglas, having the first speech, made an unusually brilliant effort. He carried the crowd with him, and when Lincoln rose to reply, it was evident that he felt his disadvantage, felt, too, that, do what he would, final defeat was probable. He made a good speech, but not one of his best. Concluding his argument, he stopped and stood silent for a moment, looking around upon the throng of half indifferent, half friendly faces before him, with those deep-sunken, weary eyes that always seemed full of unshed tears. Folding his hands as if they, too, were tired of the hopeless fight, he said in his peculiar monotone, "My friends, it makes little difference, very little difference, whether Judge Douglas or myself is elected to the United States Senate. But the great issue which we have submitted to you today is far above and beyond any personal interests or the political fortunes of any man. And, my friends, that issue will live and breathe and burn when the poor, feeble, stammering tongues of Judge Douglas and myself are silent in the grave." The crowd swayed as if smitten by a mighty wind. The simple words, and the manner in which they were spoken, touched every heart to the core. Lincoln spoke in all about 50 times during the campaign. At its close, says Mr. Arnold, both Douglas and Lincoln visited Chicago. Douglas was so hoarse that he could hardly articulate, and it was painful to hear him attempt to speak. Lincoln's voice was clear and vigorous, and he really seemed in better tone than usual. His dark complexion was bronzed by the prairie sun and winds, his eye was clear, his step firm, and he looked like a trained athlete, ready to enter, rather than one who had closed, a conflict. Of the speeches in this campaign, Mr. Henry J. Raymond, the distinguished journalist, pronounced the following well-considered opinion: "While Douglas fully sustained his previous reputation and justified the estimate his friends had placed upon his abilities, he labored under the comparative disadvantage of being much better known to the country at large than was his antagonist. During his long public career, people had become partially accustomed to his manner of presenting arguments and enforcing them. The novelty and freshness of Lincoln's addresses, on the other hand, the homeliness and force of his illustrations, their wonderful pertinence, his exhaustless humor, his confidence in his own resources, engendered by his firm belief in the justice of the cause he so ably advocated, never once rising, however, to the point of arrogance or superciliousness, fastened upon him the eyes of the people everywhere, friends and opponents alike. It was not strange that more than once, during the course of the unparalleled excitement which marked this canvass, Douglas should have been thrown off his guard by the singular self-possession displayed by his antagonist, and by the imperturbable firmness with which he maintained and defended a position once taken. The unassuming confidence which marked Lincoln's conduct was early imparted to his supporters, and each succeeding encounter added largely to the number of his friends, until they began to indulge the hope that a triumph might be secured in spite of the adverse circumstances under which the struggle was commenced." Samuel Bowles, editor of the Springfield, Massachusetts, Republican, said that Lincoln handled Douglas as he would an eel, by main strength. Sometimes perhaps he handled him so strongly that he slipped through his fingers. "In this canvass," says Mr. Lamon, "Mr. Lincoln earned a reputation as a popular debater second to that of no man in America, certainly not second to that of his famous antagonist. He kept his temper. He was not prone to personalities. He was fair, frank, and manly, and, if the contest had shown nothing else, it would have shown at least that Old Abe could behave like a gentleman under very trying circumstances." His marked success in these discussions was probably no surprise to the people of the Springfield district, who knew him as well as they did Mr. Douglas, or even better. But in the greater part of the State, and throughout the Union, the series of brilliant victories successively won by an obscure man over an orator of such wide experience and renown was received with exclamations of astonishment alike by listeners and readers. Caleb Cushing, the distinguished Massachusetts lawyer, was one of those acute minds whose attention was attracted to Lincoln by his debates with Douglas. Mr. Cushing said that these debates showed Lincoln to be the superior of Douglas in every vital element of power, and added that "the world does not yet know how much of a man Lincoln really is." It was soon to know him much more clearly. In less than 2 years after the great debate, this lately obscure Illinois lawyer was elected President of the United States. Chapter 11c.